There is a moment, not a metaphor, not a poetic device, an actual measurable documented moment, when the heart stops, when the lungs collapse into silence, when every electrical signal in your brain begins to dim like lights going out in a city at midnight. And science has always told us that in that moment, you end. But something strange keeps happening, something that cannot be explained by oxygen levels, or neurological misfiring, or the desperate hallucinations of a dying brain, something that has now been documented in over 2,000 clinical cases across 14 countries. And what it suggests, what it quietly, uncomfortably, undeniably suggests, is that what you are may not end when your body does. This is not a story about religion. This is not a story about belief. This is a story about data, about cardiac wards and resuscitation rooms, about scientists who began as skeptics and ended as something far more unsettled. This is a story about the 21 minutes after clinical death, and what or who remains inside them. Let's begin where every human story eventually arrives. The moment the heart stops, not slows, not weakens, stops. In clinical medicine, this is called cardiac arrest. And it is different from death in the way that a door closing is different from a wall. One can still be opened. In the first seconds after cardiac arrest, the body does something remarkable in its stillness. It doesn't simply switch off. It begins a process that medical science is only now beginning to understand, and only now beginning to fear the implications of. In 2023, a team of researchers at the University of Michigan published findings that made quiet headlines in neuroscience journals, and much louder ones everywhere else. They had been monitoring the brains of unconscious dying patients in their final minutes, patients whose hearts had stopped, patients who by every clinical definition were no longer alive. And in those patients, in those exact minutes of confirmed cardiac arrest, they detected something that should not have been there: a surge, a powerful, coherent, synchronized wave of electrical activity, not the random misfiring of a collapsing brain, but organized, intentional looking, structured, the kind of brain activity associated not with dying, but with being intensely, powerfully, overwhelmingly conscious. Stop for a moment and let that settle, because it matters more than almost anything science has quietly uncovered in the last 2 decades. Your brain, at the moment your heart stops, does not go quiet. It ignites. The researchers called it a surge of gamma activity. Gamma waves, the highest frequency brain waves we know of. The ones associated with peak states of consciousness, deep meditation, moments of profound insight. The ones that, in living people, appear during the most intensely aware moments a human being can experience. And there they were, in the dying, stronger, in some cases, than anything recorded during normal waking life. Now here is where the science becomes something harder to hold in your hands, because simultaneously, in hospitals across the world, people who had been resuscitated from cardiac arrest were reporting experiences, not dreams, not delusions, experiences, with a specificity, a coherence, and a similarity to each other that defies statistical accident. Dr. Sam Parnia, a critical care physician and one of the world's leading researchers on what happens at the boundary of life and death, has spent over 2 decades collecting these accounts. What he found was not chaos, it was pattern. The people who came back described, almost universally, a sensation of leaving the body, not floating, not drifting, leaving, with full cognitive clarity, with the ability to observe, to perceive, to understand. They described watching their own resuscitation from above. And then, when those accounts were checked against the actual clinical records of what happened in the room, the positioning of staff, the words spoken, the equipment used, they were accurate, not metaphorically accurate, clinically, verifiably accurate, in rooms where they had been unconscious, in rooms where, by every known model of neuroscience, they could not have perceived anything. Let that sit in the silence for a moment, because this is where the comfortable story, the story where death is simply an off switch, begins to develop cracks that no amount of scientific pragmatism has yet been able to fully seal. Dr. Parnia's landmark AWARE study, Awareness During Resuscitation, placed visual targets on high shelves in cardiac wards. Images that could only be seen from above. Images invisible from any floor-level position in the room. The design was elegant in its logic. If patients truly left their bodies during cardiac arrest, if consciousness truly detached from the physical brain, then some of them should be able to report what those images showed. And some did. The number was not enormous, but it was not zero. And in this field, not zero means everything. Now we must slow down. Because here is where the science and the soul begin to speak the same language, and it becomes almost unbearable to listen to. What is consciousness? Not who has it, not where it lives, what is it? For most of the history of neuroscience, the answer was assumed rather than discovered. Consciousness, we said, is what the brain produces, the way a candle produces light. You extinguish the candle, the light ends. You stop the brain, the consciousness ends. Clean, mechanical, final. But the candle model has a problem. It cannot explain the surge. It cannot explain the accurate observations from outside the body. It cannot explain why, in study after study, the experiences reported by those who have returned from clinical death share structural and emotional similarities, so profound they have been replicated across cultures, languages, ages, and belief systems. People who had never heard of each other. People from opposite sides of the earth. People who had no shared religious framework, all describing the same corridor, all describing the same light, all describing the same feeling, not of ending, but of arriving. In the minutes immediately following cardiac arrest, the body enters a state called the agonal phase. The word comes from the Greek, agonia, struggle. And it is a struggle, a biological negotiation between the body and whatever lies beyond it. During this phase, the brain stem, the oldest, most primitive part of the human brain, the part responsible for breath and heartbeat and the raw signal of being alive, begins to release a compound that most people have heard of, that most people associate with the farthest edges of human experience, DMT, dimethyltryptamine, found naturally in the human body, found in nearly every living organism on Earth, and now, documented in clinical research, released in measurable quantities in the brains of dying rats. Brains monitored in cardiac arrest. Brains in the act of dying. The researchers who discovered this were not mystics. They were pharmacologists. And they were shaken. Because DMT, in living humans who have encountered it, produces a remarkably consistent set of experiences. The sensation of leaving the body, encounters with presences described as intelligent, loving, ancient. A feeling of moving through space toward a light source of impossible warmth. The sense of receiving information, of understanding something, everything, in a flash of clarity so total, it cannot be translated back into language when the person returns, and the overwhelming, stubborn, unshakable conviction that what they experienced was more real than anything in waking life, more real than real. Now science stands at a crossroads it did not expect to reach. On one side, the familiar model. DMT is a neurochemical. It produces hallucinations. The experiences near death are the brain's own chemistry saying goodbye. Beautiful perhaps, meaningful perhaps, but interior, manufactured, ending with the body. On the other side, a quieter, more unsettling possibility. What if DMT is not the creator of the experience? What if it is the receiver? What if, like a radio suddenly tuned to a frequency it was never meant to find, the dying brain, flooded with DMT, surging with gamma waves, stripped of every filter that ordinary waking life imposes, becomes, for those 21 minutes, capable of perceiving something that was always there? Something it simply lacked the instrument to detect while it was busy being alive. 21 minutes, the number is not arbitrary. It comes from the clinical data. From the documented window. In ideal conditions, with proper resuscitation, during which the brain can be brought back from cardiac arrest without permanent damage. 21 minutes is the edge, the membrane between returning and not returning. And it is in this membrane, in this strange, suspended, chemically extraordinary state, that thousands of human beings have reported the same impossible thing, that they were somewhere, that they were aware, that they were, in some form that has no adequate word in any language, still themselves. There is a woman named Pam Reynolds. Her case is perhaps the most documented, most studied, most rigorously examined near-death experience in medical history. In 1991, she underwent a procedure called hypothermic cardiac arrest, a surgery so radical it requires the complete cessation of brain activity. The body is cooled to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The heart is stopped. the brain goes electrically silent. All blood is drained from the head by every definition. Not clinical death, not near death. Actual cessation of all neurological function. She was, in every measurable way, not there. During this procedure, Pam Reynolds had an experience of such vivid, structured, verifiable detail that it has never been adequately explained. She described the bone saw used to open her skull, its shape, its sound, its exact appearance, having never seen it, being under general anesthesia before it was brought into the room. She described a conversation between her surgeon and a nurse about the size of her arteries, a conversation held while her brain showed zero electrical activity. She described leaving her body, moving through a tunnel, being met by deceased relatives who told her she had to return, and she returned, with memories from a room she had never seen, from a moment when, by every instrument available to science, she was not there to see it. The materialist model, the model that says mind is only brain, that consciousness is only chemistry, has no answer for Pam Reynolds. It has theories, it has objections, it has careful academic language designed to hold the mystery at arm's length. But it has no answer. And in that space where the answer should be, in that silence, something waits. Let us talk about what happens to identity. Because this may be the most quietly devastating thing the research reveals, in case after case, in culture after culture, the people who return from clinical death report not a dissolution of self, but a clarification of it. They do not describe becoming nothing. They describe becoming more completely themselves than they had ever felt while alive. The fear, gone. The anxiety, gone. The sense of inadequacy, of unfinished business, of all the small social performances that consume a human life, gone. What remains, they say, is something so simple it almost cannot be spoken. Awareness, love, recognition, the sense, not of an ego surviving, but of something underneath the ego. Something that was never born and therefore cannot die. Something that wore the personality the way a person wears a coat, and then simply set it down. Dr. Kenneth Ring, one of the founding researchers of near-death studies, spent decades analyzing the after-effects in people who had returned, and the after-effects were as remarkable as the experiences themselves. Reduced fear of death, not just manageable, but essentially absent, increased compassion. A shift in values away from achievement and status and toward connection and meaning. In some cases, documented, measured cases, the spontaneous appearance of abilities that weren't present before. Heightened intuition, sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, changes in bioelectrical readings that persisted for years, as though whatever the person had briefly touched had left a residue, as though whatever frequency the dying brain had briefly tuned to had slightly altered the instrument. There is a concept in quantum physics called non-locality, the idea that particles, once connected, remain connected regardless of the distance between them. That information passes between them, not through space, and not across time, but through something that has no name yet in the vocabulary of matter. Some physicists, and this is still a minority, and still contested, have begun asking whether consciousness itself might be non-local, whether mind might not be produced by the brain but might be received by it, whether the brain is not the candle but the lens, and whether death, rather than extinguishing the light, simply removes the lens. Dr. Stuart Hameroff and Sir Roger Penrose, a physician and a mathematical physicist, proposed a theory called orchestrated objective reduction, ORCAR. The idea, in its most radical implication, is that consciousness is a fundamental feature of the universe, not an emergent property of biology, not an accident of evolution, a feature, the way gravity is a feature, the way time is a feature, something that exists in the fabric of reality itself, and that biological brains, through quantum processes and structures called microtubules inside neurons, are tuned to access. And when the brain dies, when the quantum coherence that allows it to tune to consciousness collapses, the theory suggests that the information, the pattern, the quantum state that constituted that particular consciousness does not vanish. It returns to the field, to the universe, to whatever it is that everything comes from and returns to. This is not religion, this is physics. And it is being said, quietly, carefully, but said, in the corridors of some of the most prestigious research institutions on Earth. We are approaching the edge of what language can hold. So let us slow down, and let us simply sit with what we actually know. We know that the brain, at clinical death, does not go quiet, it surges. We know that this surge involves the highest order brain waves associated with peak consciousness. We know that DMT, a compound with a 60,000-year relationship with human experiences of non-ordinary reality, is released in the dying brain. We know that thousands of people have returned from clinical death with accounts that are structurally similar, emotionally coherent, and in documented cases, verifiably accurate. We know that the after effects of these experiences are lasting and measurable and real. We know that the materialist model cannot fully account for any of this. And we know that the people who have been there, the people who have stood in that doorway and looked through and then come back, almost unanimously describe not annihilation, but continuation. Here is the thing about the soul that science has never been able to measure. It has never been able to measure it because measurement requires an instrument. And every instrument we possess was built inside the assumption that the physical world is all there is. You cannot use a ruler to measure love. You cannot use a thermometer to measure meaning. And perhaps, you cannot use a brain scan to measure whatever it is that survives the brain. What if the absence of measurement is not proof of absence? What if the silence in our instruments is simply the sound of something operating at a frequency we have not yet built the tools to hear? The people who come back change, not in the way that trauma changes people, not contracted, not diminished, expanded. They speak differently about time, about other people, about what matters. They become almost universally less afraid of death and more afraid of not having truly lived. They become more tender, more patient, more interested in the inner lives of strangers, as though they have glimpsed, briefly, through a door that was not meant to open, a version of reality in which everything is connected, in which nothing is wasted, in which the love you felt, and the love you gave, and the love you were too frightened to offer, none of it disappeared. None of it was ever lost. There is a man who returned after 18 minutes of clinical death. His name is not important. What he said is, I wasn't afraid, I wasn't anything that I normally am. I was just aware in a way that felt like the first time, like waking up inside waking up. And the awareness was warm. It wasn't a place. It was a state. And in that state I understood, not with my brain, not with thought. I understood that I had never not existed, and that I never would. He is not a poet. He is a retired electrician from Ohio. And he said it the way a person describes something they simply saw. What happens in the 21 minutes after clinical death? Science says, a measurable neurological event, a surge, a chemistry, a cascade, and then silence. But the silence is not empty. The people who have returned from it describe it as the fullest, most populated, most vividly real silence they have ever encountered. A silence that knew their name. A silence that was, in some way they cannot put language to, glad they had come. Perhaps we have always been asking the wrong question. Perhaps the question was never, is there something after death? Perhaps the